Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. All praise due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last messenger of Allah. In the previous class, we were looking at the goals, basically, of legislation, or we call it the basis of the legislation, and they were identified as four. The removal of difficulty we looked at, where the Sharia doesn't seek to place additional burdens on people. In fact, it seeks to remove them. And if one looks at Christianity with regards to Islam, one might say that going from Christianity to Islam, burdens have been increased. So how do we explain that principle when Allah says that He wishes ease for you and not difficulty? How do we explain that?
In Christianity, everything has been removed, everything has been taken away, everything is, it's all free for all. Whereas Islam has been, from Judaism, the laws have been made easier, and some of them have been restricted, some of them have been removed. Okay,
what you have said, that in Christianity, all the laws basically were cancelled, and that in Islam, the laws have reduced what existed in Judaism. See, the answer is in what you said, but it isn't the answer to the question, right? The question was, if one says that Islam came to make things easier, and a Christian says, well, Islam came after Christianity and it has made things more difficult, then your question, the answer is inside of your answer, but it's not the answer. So the answer that you would give the Christian who says that, because remember, try to keep focused as we study, that the goal of the study is to be able to understand Islam and its principles and to be able to present it to others. So the goal of the course is da'wah. That's why actually in a number of universities this course was called Da'wah wa Usul al-Din, the calling of people to Allah, Islam, and the fundamental principles of the religion. The fundamental principle of the religion, Usul al-Din, was to help the da'i, one who calls, give him or her the ammunition to be able to effectively call others to Allah. So, the answer then to the Christian would be that the reduction did take place. It took place in the laws which were affirmed by Prophet Jesus. True Christianity contained a series of laws, which were the Judaic laws. Now, in the time of Prophet Jesus, there was some reduction. Some reduction took place. He removed some of the burdens that existed from the previous time. Allah had put certain laws on the Jews for their disobedience, their obstinacy in dealing with the instructions which were given to them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in Jesus' time, there was some reduction. But further reduction took place when you go from Judaism, which we could say the Mosaic law and the system of Mosaic law, which Jesus affirmed, and Islam. So the comparison that they are making between Christianity as we know it today and Islam, of course, is an incorrect comparison, because Christianity as we know it today was not the religion which was brought by Jesus. So this would be the systematic answer of that particular question. But as I said, your answer was contained. The answer was contained in your answer, but how you make that presentation, you need to do it step by step so that they can logically follow. Yes, that's the case. Yes, that's the case. Okay, we understand why.
Isn't it that we say that, as you said in the previous lecture, that Allah prescribed these things to make it easy for us to remember?
Well, the answer that Allah prescribed these things to make it easy to remember Him was not the answer to the question which I raised. Questions I raised had to do with the principle that in legislation, one of the basic principles of legislation in Islam is the removal of difficulty. We have a number of examples of it, whether it's the shortening of the prayers for the traveler, joining of the prayers. The first was fasting is not required to fast while traveling. A variety of different circumstances. Prophet ﷺ joining prayers in Medina without any cause. Joining prayers, not a traveler, no rain, no illness. He joined prayers, and the companion said he did that to remove difficulty from the ummah. So where a person finds any, that kind of difficulty, the idea to make the intention, join your prayers, is legitimate. To make it as a regular practice, where, say as the Shia did, where they just join Dhuhr and Asr, join Maghrib and Isha, so they only play it 3 times a day standard, this is not acceptable. This is not acceptable. And this may be said that this is modern Shiites, because you will find within the scholarship of the Shiites those who said that though it is permissible to join the prayers, Dhuhr and Asr, Maghrib and Isha, it is preferable to pray them individually at their times. Anyway, the second principle was the reduction of religious obligations, right? Reduction. First one is removal of difficulty, making the religion easy. The other one is reduction of religious obligations. Allah provides ways out for everybody in the time of difficulties. The third, the realization of public welfare, that where things are beneficial for the community as a whole, we find the Islamic law through principles like naskh or abrogation, allowing laws to be gradually introduced, taking into account the need of the community, because they were used to certain things. For example, alcohol, etc. It was so widespread, the idea of its prohibition immediately would have created some difficulty there. So Allah gradually brought them into it, being the first generation where the laws of Islam were being laid out. He did it gradually to build that first generation, make them particularly strong, because it was their duty, their responsibility to carry Islam to the world. And we gave a variety of other examples of that. The last principle, which is where we stopped, was that of the realization of universal justice. However, there was a point when we were looking at other ways by which the need of the community or public welfare was taken into account. We said that besides the issue of abrogation, the fact that the reasons behind the laws were given allowed people to be able to deduce from them principles which could be applied outside for other circumstances which would arise, which were not mentioned, at the time of the law, right? Also, because of the, we mentioned that legislative consideration of human needs can also be found in the methodology of legislation. In the case where laws wherein human benefits will not change with time or conditions, Allah spelled out these in detail. Remember we talked about this, that issues of Islamic law which are unchangeable, the details regarding them are spelled out. Whereas laws wherein there was a need for modification, changes in time, then we find the details are not spelled out, like in the business transactions, because there are different customs in different areas which allow people to do certain things, and you take into account their customs, and the laws were left sort of general to allow for certain differences. Now, because for example, like the law where you should not purchase or sell what you don't possess. Right? This is a general law. But in the case of purchasing a home which is not built, what do you do here? The person who's going to build it requires you to pay the money before he builds it. Because you're paying the money allows him to buy the building materials, and then he builds the home. Same thing, you want to buy a boat. Of course now you have ready-made boats ready, and so as you have houses ready-made ready. But you also have people who are boat builders. You want to buy a boat, you come to him, you describe what you want, he shows you a picture of it, etc., and you buy it. So in this case, you're actually buying something which doesn't exist. And he takes your money and buys the materials and brings that thing into existence. So where this is a common practice, and it's understood, well known throughout the world, this is allowable. This doesn't become disallowable. But where it is something like, I sell you fish in a pond, right? I've not specified which fish, so you now have to go catch the fish. No, okay, that's not allowed. Or I sell you whatever is inside of this box. You don't know what's inside of the box. You buy the box and whatever comes inside of it. No, it's not allowed. So these kinds of things, these are the things which have been specifically prohibited, whereas other standard practices which don't involve really deception or possible harm to people, because it's a standard procedure. You need to buy the materials to build. This is the norm. So they allow it. Same thing when you go into a restaurant, right? You're buying food, you agree when you make the menu that you'll buy this food before they go out in the back there and cook it up. But this has become a standard, a norm. They show you a picture of it, you recognize it, and you agree to pay this, even though it hasn't been produced for you. Right? There was another principle which we didn't cover, wherein legislative consideration, takes into account the welfare of the community as a whole, and that is where it gives precedence to the general welfare over the individual harm and benefit, right? Which could be looked at also as a principle which we'll be studying later on in Fiqh maxims, the preventing the greater evil through adopting the lesser evil. Preventing the greater evil through adopting the lesser evil. What is the difference between this principle and what we'll call this, the ends justify the means? Because aren't you considering the ends here? There's a greater evil. So in order to prevent that greater evil, you do the lesser evil. Okay, an example wherein Islamic Sharia does this is in the case of polygamy. It's a classic example. In the case of polygamy, where if we look on an individual scale with regards to women, polygamy hurts them. Most women are hurt when a man takes another wife. Their feelings are hurt. Emotionally they are hurt. That is a norm. So why then, because that's the question that was asked, why then does Islam allow polygamy when there's harm to women?
Because of the greater good that it brings.
Because its prohibition creates a greater harm in the society. Where it has been prohibited, then what is the consequence? Prostitution, illegitimate children, disease, all kinds of consequences, evil consequences that come when it is prohibited. So Islam instituted it. It didn't institute it actually because it already existed. It's being practiced all over the world, even in the countries that say we don't practice it, right? But what Islam did was it regulated it, right? It limited it to 4, identified people's rights within it, confirmed the genealogy for the children, etc., to prevent the greater harm of not permitting it in the society. So that's an example. One could say, though, those who use the principle, because I'm sure you're all familiar with this, is Machiavelli's principle that the ends justify the means. So if you have good ends in mind, any means that you use to get there is justified by it, right? Even though there's harm involved. But if there's a good that you're seeking, then it's okay. Machiavelli, advising the prince, how does he deal with people, how to rule, he gave him this advice. And it's a well-known principle. The ends justify the means. But we know that Islam rejects this principle outright. It says that the means determine the ends. If you use haram means, you get haram ends. If you use halal means, you get halal ends. So now, how do we distinguish between the ends justifying the means and this other principle of preventing the greater evil with a lesser evil? Okay, think about it, and we'll hear your answers in the next class. Anyway, that was the last of the principles that come under the general heading of Islamic law taking into account human welfare, the welfare of the general welfare of the society. The last of the principles, actually, of the four, is that of realization of universal justice. Realization of universal justice. That is, as a basic principle, Islam regards all human beings as being the same with regards to their obligation to submit to divine laws and their responsibilities for breaking them. This is where equality begins and ends from the Islamic perspective. All human beings are exactly the same with regards to, as it's all human beings who have all their faculties, because obviously those who are mad, insane, children, etc., are not included in this, right? We talk about all human beings who are mature and sane, right? They all are equal, male and female. They're all equal in regards to their obligation to submit to the divine law, meaning Allah has commanded them and He has prohibited them. They're all equally responsible to obey His commands. And they're all equally responsible, or we could say, for breaking them. They're all equally required to obey His commands and equally responsible for breaking them. And what you find is that in many of the laws in the Qur'an, you find them very general, commanding justice. Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan. Allah has enjoined justice and righteousness. General commands. Allah commands you to return your trust to whom they are due, and when you judge between one man and another, you judge justly. That is Surah An-Nisa, verse 58. And the famous verse in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 8, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُونُوا قَوَّامِينَ لِلَّهِ شُهَدَاءَ بِالْقِسْطِ. O you believe, stand out firmly for Allah as witnesses to be fair in dealing. وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَنْ لَا تَعْدِلُوا اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. And do not let the hatred of a people cause you to not be just. Be just, for it's closer to piety, and fear Allah, for verily Allah is well aware of whatever you do. And the classic example of that was the case where a woman from the Makhzum tribe stole some jewelry and confessed to the crime and was brought before the Prophet ﷺ. The tribesmen wanted to avoid the shame of having one of their noble women having her hand amputated. So they approached Usama ibn Zayd, since he was so close to the Prophet ﷺ, and tried to get him to intercede on her behalf. When Usama approached the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ reacted angrily. So angrily, in some narrations, Usama said that he had never seen the Prophet ﷺ so angry before. Anyway, the Prophet ﷺ gathered the people and said, "Do you dare to intercede in one of Allah's fixed punishments?" He then called the people and delivered a sermon in which he said, "The people before you were destroyed because they let the nobles go when they stole, but applied Allah's fixed punishment to the weak when they stole. By Allah, if my own daughter Fatima stole, I would cut off her hand." So that's the Prophet ﷺ showing that he was not above the law, his family were not beyond the law, everybody was governed by the law. They were all equal before the law. Right? And even you find a number of verses in the Qur'an where Allah will mention the commandment for both men and women. Though the general mention for men suffices for both men and women throughout the Qur'an, still were people to further emphasize that it is the same for men and women, he will mention the women doing the same thing. We find that in a number of other verses. That completes our look at the Qur'an, the major source of Islamic law. The other source is that of the Sunnah. Right? Is that of the Sunnah. And the Sunnah basically represented the clarification of the Quranic commands. And we take the Sunnah as the second source of law and the second source of revelation based on Allah's statement in the Quran, for example, in Surah An-Najm, verse 53, verses 3 and 4, that Surah An-Najm is the 53rd chapter, where Allah says there concerning the Prophet ﷺ, وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. He does not speak from his desires. Verily, it is inspiration which has been revealed. So Allah clarifies that what the Prophet ﷺ instructed, what he commanded, what he explained, this was based on inspiration, wahi, revelation to him, right? Not necessarily in the form of the direct word of Allah, and it could be sometimes, but maybe just inspiration from the point of view that Allah put that idea in his mind, revealed the concept to him, and then he expressed it to us. So his job was to clarify the message which came to him, as Allah said, and instructed him, Ya ayyuhar rasul, balligh ma unzila ilayka min rabbik. O messenger, convey what has been revealed to you from your Lord. His job was primarily to convey that message. And Allah said, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ وَلَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. We have revealed the reminder, the Qur'an, to you in order that you explain to humankind what was revealed to them, that perhaps they may reflect. So Allah clearly states here that the Prophet ﷺ's job was to explain the Qur'an to the society that he was sent to. Now, the way in which the Prophet ﷺ explained it was not always words. Sometimes he did it in deeds. Sometimes it was explained through actions done in his presence, which he approved. So it could come in a variety of different forms. It's not always a statement from the Prophet ﷺ. So, for example, he might have said, pray as you see me pray, as Allah said, establish the prayer, aqimus salah, right? Establish the prayer. Then the Prophet ﷺ said, pray as you see me pray. So he has clarified it with a statement. But on other occasions, we see Prophet ﷺ doing things like, for example, he came in and he saw Ibn Mas'ud praying with his left hand over his right hand, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So he corrected him. He took his left hand, put his right hand on top of it, whilst he's in prayer. This is also telling us that it is permissible to correct somebody, you're not going to create fitna, to correct somebody while they're in prayer, if you see them doing something wrong. Externally or rather internally. For example, you're standing in prayer and people, they're not lined up properly. So for you to nudge the person beside you to straighten the line, this is acceptable. As Prophet ﷺ had said, straightening the line is a part of establishing the prayer. You know? Or, for example, you see somebody praying in the wrong direction, you can come and turn them to the correct direction. Right? Also, we know that Prophet ﷺ on some occasion, whilst he was praying, people came and gave salams to him in prayer. And his response was to raise his hand. So we know that doesn't interfere with the prayer. If somebody gives salams to you, not realizing that you're in prayer, you can respond to them by raising your hand. And in some details of the prayer, you also find the Prophet ﷺ saying, for example, if any of you make sujood, إِذَا سَجَدَ أَحَدُكُمْ فَلَا يَبْرُكْ كَمَا يَبْرُكُ الْبَعِيرُ. Do not kneel as the camel kneels. فَلْيَضَعْ يَدَيْهِ قَبْلَ رُكْبَتَيْهِ. Put his hands down before his knees. So we have a clear statement of the Prophet ﷺ, clarifying the method of going into sujood. Hands before the knees, and this hadith is authentic. We also find the sunnah specifying certain generalities mentioned in the Qur'an. For example, where Allah says in the Qur'an, مَا آتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. This is a general instruction telling us basically whatever comes in the sunnah is a part of Allah's command. مَا يُطِعِ الرَّسُولُ فَقَدْ أَطَاعَ اللَّهُ. Whoever obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah. So this is general commands, in clarifying that whatever the Prophet ﷺ gives us in details, this is a part of what Allah has prescribed. Now, you also find where Allah says, for example, after describing all of the forbidden foods, Allah says there, وَيُحِلُّ لَهُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَيُحَرِّمُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْخَبَائِثِ. And Allah makes lawful for them the good and pure things and forbids for them the bad things. Right? As a general instruction. Then the Prophet ﷺ, on the day of the Battle of Khaybar, he prohibited the eating of domesticated donkey meat. Companions had come to him complaining that the people, out of hunger, were eating their donkeys which they traveled with, which they used for carrying their burdens, etc. So the Prophet ﷺ clarified there that it is forbidden for them to eat the flesh of domesticated donkeys. Wild donkeys you can eat, but domesticated donkeys, Prophet ﷺ said, do not eat it, it's bad, it's impure. In some narrations, it's impure. And this is also the principle used to separate and distinguish between the pig and the warthog. The pig and the wild pig. You have wild pig, which grows and has some tusks, what they call a warthog, right? The issue is, can we eat it? But because it looks like a pig, it began from the pig's family, they have some common ancestor. But the pig is forbidden, but the warthog is permissible. It is not a meat eater, it doesn't eat the flesh of other animals, it doesn't kill by the way of the canine tooth, right? Huh? What?
Doesn't eat the filth like the pig.
Okay, we say it doesn't eat filth like the pig, that is not a specific, issue, because Prophet ﷺ didn't specify that that's why it is haram. Okay?
Isn't it because it's a scavenger?
No, it's not specifically because it's a scavenger, because people who use that explanation then prohibit the eating of shrimp. Because they say shrimps are scavengers, they eat, the leftovers, the dead things in the sea, right? So they try to bring it on. I would say other animals, like a well-known scavenger is the hyena. Hyena is a well-known scavenger. And the Prophet ﷺ said that the hyena flesh is halal. You can eat it. So we can't just use scavenger as a basic principle to forbid it. Anyway, the point is that the donkey which is wild and the domesticated donkey, they look quite similar. But the flesh of the domesticated donkey is not permissible. That of the wild donkey is permissible. Right? So we don't necessarily base our prohibitions on the similarities between animals, but based on what has been specifically prohibited. The Prophet ﷺ, what is prohibited has been specifically prohibited in detail. What is beyond that, which the Prophet ﷺ, nor Allah, nor the Prophet ﷺ have specified, then we assume them to be halal. Also we find where the instruction of the Prophet ﷺ may involve the deduction of rulings from principles which exist in Quranic rulings, which Allah affirms for the Prophet ﷺ. Means he's not corrected when he does it. Because in the Quran, for example, when the Quran prohibits marrying a woman and her daughter, or the simultaneous marriage of two sisters, these are both prohibited, right? After that, the Quran says, وَأُحِلَّ لَكُمْ مَا وَرَاءَ ذَلِكُمْ. Except for these, all others are lawful. Whatever is after that is lawful. However, the Prophet ﷺ said, as narrated by Abu Huraira, one should not combine a woman with her father's sister, with her aunt, nor her mother's sister. So you cannot marry a woman and her aunt, whether the aunt by the father or the aunt by the mother, meaning the real aunt. This is the aunt from the Islamic legal perspective, because the mother's brother's wife is not considered an aunt from the Islamic perspective. In English, she's called aunt. You understand the distinction? The mother's sister is called aunt in English, and the mother's brother's wife is called aunt in English. But from the Islamic perspective, the mother's brother's wife is not considered an aunt, and you can marry her. She's not related to your mother.
This still interests at the same time, actually. But that's still prohibited, right? You're going to marry at the same time.
No, it's not the issue of simultaneous. This is combining a mother and her daughter. This is never ever. Marrying a mother and her daughter, whether meaning you marry the mother, she dies, you want to marry the daughter? No, not permissible. It's never possible. In the case of two daughters, it's simultaneous. But when the Prophet ﷺ said you should not combine a woman and her father's sister, it means a woman and her, and her father's sister or mother's sister. This is the combination, similar to marrying the two together, right? But if one dies, it is possible to marry another sister. If one sister dies, you can marry the second sister. In this case, same thing. The woman, if she dies, you can marry her sister. It's possible.
But in Islam, normally a person marries two ladies or women at the same time. If there are any evidence from Sahaba's time or any time of the Prophet where two girls were at the same time married at the same time.
Okay, asking a different question. Is there any evidence from the Sunnah where two women were married at the same time in a single ceremony, for example? Or one ceremony after the other? A person married, 1, 2. Why, I don't recall that. I can't say it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, I've never done any research on that to say exist or not exist. I haven't heard it, but it could possibly exist. And there's nothing in the law to prevent it. There's nothing in the law to prevent it, right? Wait, we'll save the question still after, right? The Prophet ﷺ had explained why. He gave the reason. He said, because if you do that, you will break family ties. So the sanctity of the relationship between a sister and another sister, if you marry them both together, then what happens is that the jealousy and the rivalry which tends to arise with co-wives, when that's introduced between sisters, it can break their relations. Because between a man and his two wives, okay, they may disagree and they don't want to cooperate with each other, so they don't want to be around each other. They can do that. It's not preferable, but if they did that, it would just be an issue of not dealing with each other. No family ties have been broken in that sense. Whereas, in the case of two sisters, or in the case of a woman and her aunt, when you combine the two, and the rivalry comes, when they don't want to talk to each other, they don't want to see each other, then you are breaking family ties. So the principle of not combining was to prevent the harm to family ties. So that's where the Prophet ﷺ, he made his own deduction. It is assumed that he made his own deduction and gave that ruling also. And Allah approved it, because no law came after he made that statement to say otherwise. However, there are some times when the Prophet ﷺ approved laws when Allah corrected him. When Allah corrected him, as in the case of zihar, divorce, where the man says, "You're like my mother's back," right? And which was the way that, one of the ways of divorce, which left the woman hanging, etc. Well, a woman came to the Prophet ﷺ and complained. Her name was Khawla bint Tha'laba. She came and complained to the Prophet ﷺ that, her husband, Aus ibn as-Samit, had done this to her. And that was one of the methods of divorce which existed at the time. The Prophet ﷺ told her that she has been divorced and to accept it. But Allah revealed the verse saying that, your wives are not like your mothers, etc. And clarified that this was not a valid form of divorce. So this would be considered a case of rulings which the Prophet ﷺ deduced himself, but Allah did not affirm. So you have that body of information, and it is considered part of the Sunnah, but it is part of the unconfirmed Sunnah. We also have another body of the unconfirmed Sunnah, where Prophet ﷺ did or said things and Allah did not approve it, which are to demonstrate and to clarify that personal issues which are not related to the religion itself, Prophet ﷺ in those matters was a human being. He was not infallible with regards to the law. So we have, for example, in the case of the date trees of Medina, where Prophet ﷺ had come to Medina and found them artificially pollinating the date trees, and he suggested to them that perhaps this would be better if they didn't do it, because Islam in general, as a principle, doesn't like the artificial plucking eyebrows, right? Shaving the beard, tattooing, making artificial spaces between teeth. These things the Prophet ﷺ forbade. Some people might say, what about clipping fingernails? Isn't that removing things artificially? Well, it has to be removed to prevent disease. It is, germs are collected under the fingernails. So that's why doctors and surgeons, etc., they keep their fingernails short. So this is part of hygiene, cleanliness. There's a rationale behind it. It's not just for the sake of beauty. Similarly, in the case of removing pubic hair under your armpits, here in the private parts, people might say again, hey, this is unnatural. But again, when people are going to have operations, or women are going to have a baby, the common practice is to shave her, remove the pubic hair, because this is an area where germs do collect, etc., etc. So it has a hygienic basis. Don't compare the two. Some people even argue the same thing with circumcision of men. That this is unnatural. You're removing something which people are born with. Why put people through that? But again, the medical profession has proven that it is cleaner. The chances of getting penile cancer is reduced tremendously, and also they even showed that the rate of AIDS, people catching AIDS, is far higher amongst those who are uncircumcised than those who are circumcised. It's not to say that if you're uncircumcised, you're safe from AIDS. No, but it's just the instance of those catching it, so it shows that there's a clear benefit with regards to it. So even when the Prophet ﷺ had told the companions there to stop artificially pollinating the trees, then the following year the yield dropped. So they came back to him and asked him. He told us not to do it, and it harmed us. So the Prophet ﷺ said, I'm a human being. So when I tell you something pertaining to the religion, accept it. But when I tell you something from my personal opinion, keep in mind that I'm a human being. And in some narrations he said, you have better knowledge of technical skills in the affairs of this world. So he clarified that we don't necessarily take each and everything which he did. There are personal things that his likes and his dislikes. He didn't like to eat, for example, lizard, right? He didn't like to eat lizard, but he didn't prohibit it. That was just his personal dislike. A particular lizard called the dob, which is considered a delicacy amongst the Bedouins, found mainly in the desert, is perfectly permissible. If you want to eat it, it's legitimate. So, Prophet ﷺ also clarified with regards to rulings that he made when people came to him for judgment. He clarified that he might rule. He's saying, that sometimes, he said, I'm only a human being. You bring your disputes to me. Perhaps some of you are more eloquent in their plea than others, and I judge in their favor according to what I hear from them. So whatever I rule in anyone's favor which belongs to his brother, he should not take any of it, because I've only granted him a piece of hell. He warned him. You know better, because you've got the gift of gab, you're able to explain better, and you're now getting property which is not yours. Know that if I rule that for you, I'm ruling for you a piece of hell. So he warned them, I'm only a human being. I can only judge as exists. Well, now one may raise the question, why didn't Allah just protect him from any mistakes in this regard? Why allow him to make mistakes? Why put him in that position where he has to give that explanation? Why not just make him infallible in all spheres? The point is that the Prophet ﷺ made mistakes, and Allah allowed him to make mistakes and clarify those mistakes, on one hand, to clarify to people that he was not infallible. Because it is the nature of people to want to elevate their leaders beyond their status. So he made him fallible. He allowed him to be fallible. So people would not have that excuse later on. Of course, you do have people later on denying that these things occurred, because the Shiites, for example, consider him infallible, as well as the in Pakistan, India, the largest sect amongst the mainstream Muslims, known as the Brailwis, they also hold the Prophet ﷺ to be infallible, right? And that all these narrations which mention his mistakes, these are all false. They reject them, But in fact, these narrations are correct, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitted them in order for us to know and have no doubt about the fallibility of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in this regard. Furthermore, it was training for the Sahaba. It was training for the Sahaba in ijtihad, that the Prophet ﷺ would make ijtihad. Because when he went, there would be people who would judge after him. And what would happen when they made mistakes? How do you deal with these things? So the Prophet ﷺ clarified that whenever a person, a judge or whatever, makes ijtihad, strives to find the correct ruling, and is correct, he gets 2 reward. And if he's incorrect, he gets 1. So there is that allowance there, that we would make the effort to judge in our affairs. But we do it based on knowledge, because he warned that there are 3 judges, 2 in hell and 1 in paradise. The one in paradise is the one who knows the truth and judges according to it. One who knows the truth and does not judge according to it, he's in hell. One who doesn't know the truth And even if he judges the truth, he's in hell. Even if his judgment turns out to be right, he's in hell. Why? Because he judged without knowledge. Right? So, Prophet ﷺ clarifies that though the judge may be incorrect, his judgment may be incorrect, he still gets a reward if he is judging according to what he knows of the truth. He doesn't judge not knowing what the truth is, just for the sake of the judgment. And Prophet Muhammad ﷺ also encouraged his companions to make judgment themselves, even though they were very shy about it, etc. He would on different occasions call on them to make judgments. So for example, when he sent Ali ibn Abi Talib to Yemen as a judge, Ali ibn Abi Talib had asked, "O Messenger of Allah, you're sending me and I'm young and I have no knowledge of giving judgment." But the Prophet ﷺ replied to him and said, "Allah will guide your heart and keep your tongue firmly attached to the truth." But then he gave him some basic advice. He said, when two litigants sit before you, do not decide until you have heard what the other has to say the way you heard the first. For it is more suitable for the correct judgment to become clear to you. General principle: the judge should listen to what both sides have to say. Because if you only hear one side, of course, whoever is explaining is going to explain it to win the case. He's going to explain it from his perspective. So, listen to both sides. In other narrations, he said, don't judge when you're angry. Your wife upset you. You came into the court. You're upset. So the case comes before you. You make a judgment. But your judgment is not really, you've not really, made a just judgment here. You're just still being affected by your home situation. They call it the name for that, where somebody hits you, so you hit somebody else. What do they call that now? Something like that. No, it's like displaced aggression or something like this. But the point is that you're hitting somebody else because somebody hit you. Right? So it's the same way you're judging harshly on that individual because of a harsh situation which developed in your home. So the advice was, don't judge when you're in a state of anger. So we find that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions were engaged in ijtihad. On one occasion, after the Qurayza tribe was captured, their fortress was overcome, and they captured the people. Remember, this is the same well-known hadith about after the battle of the Khandaq, where the Prophet ﷺ sent them to go and tackle the Qurayza tribe because they had committed an act of treachery by betraying a treaty which they had between themselves and the Muslims. So the point is that when they were captured, the Prophet ﷺ gave the judgment to Sa'd. Sa'd, who was close to them. They had been dealing with Sa'd, and the Prophet ﷺ asked him to make the judgment. And they were pleased with that he chose Sa'd. But Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, not Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, he ruled that their warriors, those who were the fighters, should be executed. And the women and children should be taken as prisoners. And when the Prophet ﷺ heard his judgment, he said, you judge by what Allah above the heavens judged. He affirmed his judgment, and that was a case of the Sahaba making a judgment, the Prophet ﷺ affirming it. The Prophet ﷺ encouraging the Sahaba to make judgments on certain occasions. So we say that still in this first stage, right, the foundation stage, what you find is that the fundamental sources of Islamic law is still the Qur'an and the Sunnah. Because whatever ijtihad was made by the Prophet ﷺ, it was either confirmed by Allah or it was corrected by Allah. So it wasn't left independent. Similarly, whatever judgments the Sahaba made, which was in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, or which was encouraged by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, either the Prophet ﷺ confirmed what they judged or he corrected their judgment, one or the other. So still everything goes back to revelation. So the question arises, why then was there any need for ijtihad on the part of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions? Why not just leave it all as revelation? The reason being that this was training for the Sahaba. Training for a time when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would not be there to affirm their judgments, etc. So they were given training in ijtihad, preparation for the time to come. On the last page of the section, you have a summary of 5 main points which come from the section. 1, Islamic law in this early period consisted of the laws of Sharia, which were revealed and recorded in the Qur'an and the Sunnah. And they relate mainly to the ideological foundation of Islam and Iman, and the socio-economic laws necessary for the organization of the new Muslim state in Medina. Secondly, the basis of legislation in the Qur'an was that of human reformation, not the destruction of all that existed and its replacement, right? And all beneficial customs and practices were recognized. And this is why you have a principle which we're going to look at later on when we look at the principles of Fiqh. Urf. Urf is the custom of an area, is recognized where it doesn't go against Islamic Sharia statements of Prophet ﷺ, explanations, etc. It is accepted, the urf. So that urf may determine how a ruling is given. For example, in Syria, the term used for horse is dabba. That's the term used for horse. They use dabba. But according to Arabic, everything which crawls or walks is classified as dabba. They define dabba in Arabic as they say, ma yadubbu ala al-ard. Whatever crawls on the earth is considered dabba. So even a cockroach is considered a dabba. So now if you're in Syria and you make a contract, right, that the person will pay you $1,000 and you will give them 5 dabbas, right? Now when the person has paid you $5,000, you give him a bag of 5 cockroaches, technically speaking, according to the language, your deal is done. He has no recourse. But because of the fact that you are dealing with a Syrian who understands the term dabba to mean horse, then the law would require you to give him 5 horses. He would not accept 5 cockroaches in its place. Okay? So this is the point. Islamic law does take into account the customs of the people where it doesn't go against the Sharia. Thirdly, that in order to achieve the goal of reformation, Quranic legislation incorporated the principles of removal of difficulty, reduction of religious obligations, realization of public welfare, and realization of universal justice. Fourth point to be taken from this chapter is that this period marked the beginning of the evolution of fiqh. And it was during this period that the foundations for the science of deducing laws from the Qur'an and Sunnah were laid by the Prophet ﷺ, right? In the way that the Prophet ﷺ made certain deductions, ijtihad, and he allowed his companions to make some ijtihad. This was the foundation for qiyas, or deduction, principles of deduction. And the fifth point is that it can be said that in this period, the madhab, or legal school of thought, took shape as the Prophet ﷺ guided and trained the Sahaba in ijtihad. The madhab of the Prophet ﷺ, its principles were laid down as being following the Qur'an and the Sunnah, basically as interpreted by the Prophet ﷺ in his actions, his statements, and his approvals, as understood and narrated to us by his companions. Okay? So that covers basically our first segment. We'll pause here for any questions that you have. Go ahead.
You said that the Shia there are many groups who consider the Prophet infallible.
Not many groups, certain groups.
Certain groups. So why don't they consider the Quran, which gives an explicit surah Abbas, that he did make a mistake of not paying attention to a blind person?
Okay, brother's question. Now, where there are clear texts in the Quran and the Sunnah which indicate mistakes of the Prophet ﷺ, like in Surah Abasa, right? Abasa wa tawalla, right? Or others, places in the Quran. Why don't groups like the Shia or the Brelwis accept this as evidence that the Prophet ﷺ was fallible? What they do is they deny the Sunnah. They claim, as the Shia claim, that all of the Sunnah conveyed by the companions of the Prophet ﷺ are false. It's false. Because as far as they're concerned, all of the Prophet ﷺ's companions, except for 3 or 5, apostated, left Islam. So that way they get away from it. In the case of the Brelwis, they will just say, all these hadiths are fabricated, are false, except for the ones which we approve. Right? Now, in terms of the Quran, what do? They reinterpret the Quran. They say, Abasa wa tawalla is not referring to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's talking about Abu Bakr. So Abu Bakr is the one who turned and walked away, right? It wasn't Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in that way, they get around the obvious clear text of the Quran, which are explained. Of course, we only know because if you had the Surah Abasa wa tawalla by itself, how do you know it is Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? It's not absolutely clear. It is the companions who clarified for us what the incident was, exactly how it took place, etc., etc. They gave us the body of information to put it in context exactly for us to know, in fact, it was the Prophet ﷺ.
It's sort of that's what I said that in that so they're saying that this is not a process, and they're just pick some random Sahaba and put them in there.
Yeah, basically, by this question, even the verse where Allah says that He has, given you this great conquest, this great victory, in order to forgive what was previous of your sins, and what was to come. How do they interpret that? They interpret it by saying that it's referring to other people, besides the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, or Ali and his 11 descendants, or Fatima, because they have what they call the 14 infallibles. That is the numbers, not just the 12 Imams, it includes Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and Fatima. Two questions from the sisters. One, that in the case of polygamy presenting or preventing a greater evil, by allowing a lesser evil, could this also be looked at in the case of divorce? You could say yes. Divorce is the dismantling of the family in that sense, and because of the greater harm of people living together in hostility, where things can't be worked out, then Islam allows the dissolution of the marriage in that regard. Also, the other question which they raised was concerning the hadith which I mentioned. The Prophet ﷺ had forbidden, creating spaces between teeth, moving the teeth around in your mouth. So the question is, what about braces? Orthodontics, right? Where they've gone in, they put braces on your teeth, and basically they're shifting the teeth around in your mouth. What about that? Is that acceptable or not? We could add to that plastic surgery. Similar issues involved here. Plastic surgery, where you are changing Allah's creation. Somebody's born without an ear, and you're giving him an ear. You make a nose for him that burnt off, whatever. The point is that where you are doing something to reconstruct or to improve the health, then these things are permissible, right? And again, here comes the ends justify the means. That's the question you have to ask yourself, because so it seems like that again, because the end is that your teeth are in the proper position so you can chew better, you can eat your food properly. So that justifies you moving teeth around your mouth, which the Prophet ﷺ forbid. Right? This is the issue, right? Does the end justify the means in this case? What's the difference between really that general principle of ends justifying the means, right? And this specific example. The idea here is that we said where you're doing it to prevent a harm, because there's harm in that existing state. So to make a change for the better, child is born with the heart outside the chest. For you to cut open the chest and put the heart back inside, you're changing the way the child was born. But that heart outside, child's gonna die. It happens on some occasions. Kids are born with the heart actually outside the chest. It has happened, and other things like this. Child is born with what they call a cleft lip, where a big sort of line split in their palate. You can leave them with it looking like that, and which affects their ability to eat properly and these kind of things, just besides the way they look, then, you can leave them and say, well, that's natural, or you can say, well, let's reconstruct and make it the way that is the norm for people and which is healthier and better for them. So doing things like this on that basis is permissible. But where, one is shifting teeth around the mouth because you want a perfect set of teeth, no gaps or whatever, or you won't prefer to have a gap because in your society, having a gap between your two front teeth means, you're wise or whatever people attribute to it, then in your society you want this gap so you have it done. No, it's not acceptable.
The classic example is the Michael Jackson change the skin color. That's the river of the show.
Yeah, okay, but they gave the example of Michael Jackson, the changes that he went through. You can see they have some things on the internet where they show what he was and what he became, he changed himself completely and ended up really destroying himself. Huh?
Can't actually differentiate between he and his sister. You can't differentiate. You can't differentiate between him and his sisters.
Now?
His face. That's what he did. He looks like his sisters. That's what I'm trying to say.
No. It's not correct.
Just to add to the comment which sister said, for preventing a fatal harm for divorce case, there was a hadith of a lady who came to Prophet and she asked for Bilal because she didn't like the person. And then she again insisted that Prophet said no, because it is harming, she's not able to pray properly and concentrate and all. So this can be the example of preventing a greater harm.
Okay, brother is giving the example of the hadith found in Sahih Bukhari, which established the principle of female instituted divorce, where she initiates the divorce through the court system, known as khula, where she came to the Prophet, woman came to the Prophet ﷺ and complained that she had nothing against her husband in terms of looking after her and all the other things connected, but she just could not stand him. And it was affecting her deen, her religion. So the Prophet ﷺ approved her divorce based on the fact that it was affecting her religion, affecting how she dealt with him Islamically. She was ending up in sin because of this dislike for him, though he was a just man who looked after her needs and all these other kinds of things. So this could be also given as an example where the greater harm is prevented by choosing the lesser harm. Okay, inshallah.
Sorry. When we say that the judge shouldn't judge if he's angry, and the reason being that his anger will cloud his judgment, can we say the same thing that if the judge is tired, or if he's sad, or if he's in any emotional state other than anger, but it might cloud his judgment, that he shouldn't give judgment in that state as well?
Okay, brother is asking whether we can deduce from the Prophet ﷺ's prohibition of judgment in a state of anger to include any other emotional state which would cloud his judgment, which would affect his judgment. For example, great sorrow. His mother just died. For him to come into the court the next day feeling how he's feeling and making judgments, this would not be appropriate. Yeah, so we could say, as a general principle, any of those type of emotions which would cloud his judgment, it's better for him to avoid, taking up that position in those times.
But this classic example is generally it happens when your parents are upset or they have an argument. The frustration is shown on the kids when they commit the wrong time and ask something which the kids get away from it. You respond in a very different way.
Yeah, his brother is just saying that it's very obvious, with parents and kids where, parents may be upset and the kids come and request things, they shoo them away, they don't respond to them, whereas when they're feeling okay, they welcome them and of course that's something that, parents have to or should try to control and, be good and relate with their children well, regardless of what state they're in.
She can give excitement and happiness to him. I remember one of my friends, he had just broken a pole of a sign on the roadside. And when he went, that officer, and at that time the officer received a phone down that he's got a baby son. On the phone, and just said nothing, I mean, just let him go. So,
yeah, okay, but let's give an example that it could happen in a positive way, or we could judge it as a positive way, where the example was given of where one of his friends had just hit some public utility and damaged it, and when the policeman came to write up the fine for him, he got a phone call saying that his wife had just delivered a baby boy, so he tore up the ticket and let him go. This has been your lucky day, most to speak. Although we can say that was a good thing relative to the man, but it was not correct. It was still not correct. It's clouding his judgment. Though he's letting the man off, and of course the man is very happy for it, it's also incorrect and not just. Okay, inshallah, we close. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.